Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 23 cheat sheet. If you've never seen the cheat sheet series before, it's effectively a tier list of players looking at price point and position, and really just considering the future run of games with the decayed impact on medium to long-term games, and then looking at the underlying stats, plus my sort of collective understanding of teams, manager press conference information, and so on and so forth. So starting with this week, I'd say that the general macro topic is we're very close towards a double, and the double is a great double with Liverpool, but there's quite a few considerations that a lot of managers could be making. It's the idea of whether you want to be using the assistant manager chip or simply just going for triple Liverpool naturally with outfield players. And this is a great week to consolidate on this decision because there's so much value within an Ipswich at home fixture. And we've seen Ipswich the last two times out, not just because the last two times out is a good sample size, but I mean, seasonally, of course, they've been a very, very poor offensive team regardless, and Liverpool are at home at Anfield with a great game. Probably also going to rotate a little bit with Lille, so I think one point to mention is UCL is back and European games are back, so it's very well worth waiting for that European information before you make certain moves. We already have a big sort of updates like Jota's injury and him being prescribed to be 3 to 7 game weeks out, which means that he's going to be out of the double. So, jumping into the midfield, I've given Dango and Kluivert a rise. I don't feel super comfortable moving two Bournemouth midfielders into the green territory alongside another already pre-existing Bournemouth midfielder, but I suppose the reality is we have to look at Bournemouth as the team that they are. They're effectively a team this season where they're arguably a top 4 offense. They've put out results and underlying stats like they are this season, and we almost have to judge them as such. And so when you look at some of the underlying stats, I mentioned Dango, Ouattara myself within my sort of what we've learned series. I mentioned Semenyo as well there. These are leading players within the entire midfield category. And the most impressive thing recently that has benefited this team the most in terms of the strength of certain players like Dango and Kluivert is the sheer amount of injuries. So what we saw early in the season is Dango was on the periphery when other players like Tavernier were playing. We also had, for example, Alex Scott as well, who's gotten injured amongst Sinisterra and other players. So look, the sheer amount of injuries has made Kluivert a 90-minute player, and I think we saw that within the Newcastle game, not with the hat-trick, but the minutes. Whereas previously, you'd see Kluivert actually on the bench, even when they were very thin versus Chelsea, or someone who actually was only playing, let's say, 70 minutes a game and then getting subbed off for someone like Philip Billing, who's also left the club. So Bournemouth are in a very interesting position where you'd say the starting 11 looks very strong still, with Dango and Kluivert playing consistent minutes, and that's been a huge benefit to them. Whether they will have or suffer worse minutes when other players come back from injury is another matter, but for the short term, these are really, really strong picks. And a lot of people will probably have issue with me actually having so many midfielders within this green bracket, but I really think it's about respecting how strong, how in-depth this position is right now in FPL. So for me, it's the strongest position, the most stacked position in FPL. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm saying you should be going out and playing 3 5.x midfielders every single week. It just means you're spoiled for choice in this position, and you really should be trying to optimize around, what fixtures you're trying to rotate. Say you have, let's say, an 8-person attack, and this player is an 8th person. Find someone who rotates with some of the weaknesses in your team, where, let's say, if you've got a Bruno, maybe benching him on an odd week, that sort of thing, that sort of logic. So that's what I'd say about these players. I think they're all very good. I've always said that I think Ahmad might be the best player in this category. I still think I hold that opinion because of blank Game Week 29. However, Semenyo has been very, very strong this season. The underlying stats have been really good. And then Kluivert actually just has the mixture of minutes and penalties now. So no one else in this category has penalties except for Paquetá, but he plays for a much weaker team, and there's a very big difference there. I've given Sarr and Murphy drops. Now, Sarr, I don't think necessarily deserves a drop, but I think just recognizing sort of the shift in some of the players in this price point, Sarr does get a soft drop. I also think maybe his minutes might not be perfect, but it's also someone that you can immediately just point out, he only really suffered poor minutes because of that injury midweek, potentially due to the hamstring, and maybe he's just getting protected. Although I'd say, there are instances where, for example, someone like Palmer, very important to the Chelsea team, also suffered from injury, didn't train this week and ultimately played 90 minutes because he's probably a lot more important to the team. And directionally, I think that's where we'll probably see Sarr's minutes starting to fade a little bit, as they actually have a pretty competent attacking bench within Crystal Palace compared to, let's say, a team like Bournemouth right now, who are, struggling for it. When you look at the Bournemouth bench, I think if you really look at the last 2 to 3 lineups that they put out, there's a lot of players that I think even I myself would struggle to mention would really be good starting Premier League players. But you can see even Bournemouth are playing someone like Brooks, who honestly I haven't watched much of until he featured versus Chelsea and in some of his recent substitute appearances after a lot of these injuries. So I guess the strength of Iraola is really just to credit how well he's done with the squad he's done it with. And so Paqueta and Iwobi, these are players who I still don't love so much. I do think they're definitely a tier below. With Murphy, his minutes are starting to kind of go up and down. I think ultimately, is he more important than Gordon? No, I think, and you can see that in the Bournemouth game, where when they actually need to chase, when they actually need to get a result, who's the player that they're more likely to take off versus, let's say, a game where they're leading and they're happy to consolidate and therefore take off a Gordon and Isak earlier. So I think, yeah, that just shows you the strength in terms of the minutes of Murphy, and that's why he does get a drop. And ultimately, the fixtures are actually going to turn very harshly for Newcastle very soon. Whereas for a lot of the other players in that sort of green tier list, either the fixtures are middling and getting better, or ultimately they're just really, really good, like Rodgers in this case. In the next tier, we have Kulusevski and Mitoma being added to the sheet. Kulusevski just embarks on a great run of games starting with Leicester at home. So this is a really good time to reinvest into Tottenham. You have a Brennan Johnson injury, so that's really poor. I didn't really want to put Maddison in the sheet because I still think that he's not a very consistent, reliable pick, and I don't think his minutes are perfect. But Kulusevski's minutes are perfect, and I think he's a very solid pick, but I wouldn't say he is someone who, just surely based on his underlying stats, and I think the team strength, unfortunately, when you have so many injuries, despite the amount of minutes Kulusevski's going to get and how important he's going to be to the team, it's still going to be quite similar to, let's say, the Paqueta conundrum, where you probably have a higher importance within the team. You have some tools, like for example, Paqueta has penalties versus Kulusevski is probably a little bit better still in open play for a more functional attack, I suppose, within Tottenham. But the inevitable thing is, amongst these good run of fixtures for Tottenham, he's probably going to suffer still. As far as Mitoma, he's someone who I've added back. I don't really know what one of the recent benchings was really for. I think we've seen that Fabian does rotate. Someone like JP seems impervious to rotation, but he can even be hooked in a game where he, let's say, has a yellow. But Mitoma has played really well recently, and I still find the benching odd, so not quite sure how to put my finger on it, but it has happened a couple times, for example, coming out of international breaks, where Fabian's trying to manage his fitness, and then also one of the recent benchings as well, where, as I said, I can't really explain quite why he's done it, but Mitoma should be always a very important player. I'm just cautious to not sort of overrate him despite the recent good performances. As far as Gibbs White Martinelli, nothing really to say here. I think Martinelli's good fixtures are actually still really around. And look, the sheer lack of depth for this Arsenal team means that Martinelli is still a good pick for me. But I think we're also starting to see that, yes, this Arsenal team is generally struggling in open play, and I can see why people don't really want to spend that sort of amount of money on Martinelli still. And that's simply what it comes down to. As far as, let's say, the next tier with Gordon and Bouma Luis Diaz, I've given Luis Diaz a green. I think with Gordon, it's just about, banking on the next 2 fixtures and then probably selling him in the future, especially since the Game Week 29 blank is probably going to hit him. As far as Mbeumo, he is probably he has 1 bad fixture left, really. And arguably Crystal Palace away is not even that bad, but it's still an away fixture. It's still versus a really top defensive team. So I would say, yeah, not a great opportunity for Mbeumo here, but after that, he just embarks in an astoundingly good run of games, Game Week 24 plus. We've taken note of how maybe the underlying stats for Mbeumo haven't been amazing this season, particularly in some of our other series. But I think the most important thing to mention about Mbeumo is, look, he's still an extremely hot finisher. He's still a penalty taker, which we don't reflect in these numbers. And he has a really good run of games and has perfect minutes. And there's not really much you can lose by going for someone like Mbeumo starting from 24 or even 23. As far as Luis Diaz, he gets a rise. The Jota injury just, is just a soft boost towards him amongst the overall fixture boost, which is just 3 great games in 2 game weeks for the rest of the field who are unfortunately just playing 2 games, right? So Luis Diaz is someone who I like quite a lot. I wouldn't say that he's a player that I've always held in extremely high regard, because I think even at the start of the season, you could see some of my cheat sheet series, I didn't react exceedingly well, I guess, to his run of form. I didn't think he was suddenly going to maintain, a goal per game ratio, and I'm pretty happy, I think, with the outcome of how Luis Diaz has played up until this halfway mark of the season. So no regrets there in terms of that sort of analysis. But ultimately, more minutes, good fixtures, more fixtures than the rest of the field, that's going to be a benefit for Luis Diaz and, wanting to own him. And yes, even though Darwin showed some signs of life, it's more than likely we'll see more of Luis Diaz and Gakpo. It's possible, of course, that Darwin can actually, fight and deserve a start over the double. And I think that is something that probably people need to look into. Never mind that maybe he could even be playing versus a team like Ipswich as well. So do be cautious. I think if you go for a player within the double, just sit with the decision and enjoy the decision, because you might not get the reward fully, I think, within the first week versus Ipswich, even though that's one of the big bankers. But game week 24, you never know how things will swing. As long as you're invested into the Liverpool attack, I think you can be moderately happy. I'd also mention that Lucius is probably the one who, between him and Gakpo, is maybe slightly, I guess, out of form compared to a Gakpo who is probably entrusted to play a couple more minutes now. So let's say when Darwin comes on or a Chiesa comes on, who's the player more likely to get subbed, as opposed to, let's say, in the past where we used to see, for example, Gakpo getting subbed, Luis Diaz shifting out wide if he needed to do so. So that is a very short-term momentum thing. I think there's still really good competition for places. I don't think Slot has, Gakpo firmly first choice. I think that's a ridiculous argument to make. So the only thing I'd say is, look, ultimately the form, directionally at least, is in Gakpo's favor. With Bruno and Odegaard, I haven't really touched them. I still think they're really strong picks. Ultimately, these are, look, a lot of the value towards these players are penalty takers, penalty taking aspects and set pieces. And I'm sure a lot of people can watch Odegaard play and just think that he's absolutely diabolical. And I totally hold that argument. But at the end of the day, just looking at, for example, share market odds, expectations for penalties and things like that, bonus points in terms of how these players often contribute towards bonus points. And we saw that in recent weeks, right? At least in some of the recent weeks. There's still a lot of impact there that is not fully accounted for in just purely looking at open play and sort of goal scoring ratios on market odds. So that's what I would say about these players. They're very different to your sort of open play attackers like a Gordon, for example, and their value is also very much tied towards some of the other elements of the rules that we don't necessarily see imprinted every week when we look at, let's say, sort of sheet lists of goal scoring odds. So that's all I'll say about these players. I still think they're very, very strong. Mostly because Odegaard, actually, when you look at the Knicks' 4 fixtures, are really good. Whereas with Bruno's fixtures, they're kind of mediocre because there's a lot of away fixtures in there. And even the good fixture at home is versus a pretty strong defensive team in Crystal Palace. And you can make the argument that right now, what we're seeing from Bruno is, yes, minutes at the 10, but then also minutes playing at a center mid position. And you can never vouch for exactly how many minutes he's going to play in both positions. Although Garnacho seems like he's on the way out of United, which is going to be a benefit for Bruno and sort of him commanding that sort of 10 spot on the left. As far as Son, I've given him a rise. As far as Foden, why he's not a green, the fixtures, right? I still think, yes, Foden has shown signs of life. Luke from FS Scout, or previously from FS Scout, or even formerly from FS Scout, he's actually mentioned something that I didn't really reflect on immediately in terms of the impact to Foden, and I thought it was so interesting. Just the idea that within the recent games, we've seen Nunez almost unlock that sort of position of Foden within the field, which allows him to sort of move wide and then also occupy a lot of time inside because of the role of Nunez positionally on the pitch and what that means for Foden traditionally, where instead of just purely holding wide right, he's allowed to sort of roam as he wants and make forays into the box and things like that. What I would say is that the fixtures for City have been really kind. And so, sure, it's really nice to see Foden do well in back-to-back games. But, let's see how City perform over these games. I think the expectation for City is still quite mild, if I'm being completely honest. Looking at the underlying stats game to game, I don't think they've suddenly turned a page. I mean, just a few weeks ago, we just saw them draw versus Brentford, and it looked very much deserved for a team like Brentford. And that's all I'll say about Foden. I think he's obviously looking fantastic. But is he a green right now amongst these fixtures? Probably not. As far as Son, I've made a lot of points, I think, this season when we talk about the cheat sheet, and I've owned Son this season, and I probably think that he's unfortunately taking a turn for the worse as a player. But when you're looking at FPL, it's also a game about sort of just looking at your short term, seeing whether you can make gains and whether there's value in going for certain players, even though maybe you don't think that they're playing the best football of their lives. And to me, this applies to Son very much so because he is fitter than most of the squad. There's a lot of injuries. There's a Solanke injury. I don't know the sheer extent of the Solanke injury, but a lot of initial rumors was that Son would be, playing in the center forward position. And I think we will see that going forwards more often because Richarlison has only come back from injury himself, and Son can't play all the minutes at the center forward position. Neither can Richarlison. So they're going to share those minutes. We have Lancashire as well. We also have Mikey Moore, who's also playing exceedingly well within the left wing position. So one of the things within this Tottenham team is, yes, they've got a lot of injuries, but Son is now 100% guaranteed still on penalties, I would imagine, unless you think Maddison will take, which probably is still going to be quite a big shout. Still, though, within the previous match, I mean, you could see Son playing the full 90, which I think is a shift already within the importance of certain players in the short term while Solanke is gone. If Solanke was still in the squad, I think even that Everton match is probably still a game where arguably you could see Son come off the field, whereas he was very much allowed to stay within that game as they were chasing back, a closer insurmountable deficit versus Everton. So that kind of shows you the change in terms of the immediate minutes for Son. I think that's a huge boost considering that the next 4 games are so good for Spurs. And I'm sure if anyone actually has the opportunity to gamble into Son in the short term, I think that's actually quite a lucrative option because he's just not very well favored in the field. In the in the forward position, moving on to that quickly, because I don't have to spend time talking about Palmer and Salah every week. NDI and Calvert-Lewin gets soft rises. This is just about, if you think about the landscape, a lot of the forwards I think are quite weak compared to the midfield. I think like a 5-stack midfield is probably the preferred choice. If you had to choose between 5 midfielders and 3 forwards, what would I go for right now? I would definitely go for 5 midfielders. So just by proxy of that, you probably have a third forward who's a little bit more, I guess, non-dependable or not necessarily like mandatory to stay within your team. So you can probably look at NDI and Calvert-Lewin as a bit of a make weight this week because they're cheaper than most of the options within the game. It gives you the opportunity to maybe invest into other options. Like I myself am actually looking at moving into one of these 2 players this week so that I can actually enable myself to get Allison and benefit from an Ipswich at home fixture. So that's kind of how I'm seeing things right now with NDI and Calvert-Lewin. As far as Raul and Vardy, they get soft drops because fixtures are slightly worse for both of these players, more so in Vardy's case, particularly in the short term with Everton and Arsenal games in the distance. And even, for example, a good game like Tottenham, unfortunately, that is an away fixture. So that's why there are some soft drops there. Delap, at least himself, has actually a Southampton home game. Raul, for example, still has Man United at home, which is quite nice. Other than that, I haven't made too many changes other than maybe shifting Gakpo around in the next tier. So that's the 7.x tier where I've given Gakpo a big rise. And the reason why Gakpo is a green and Luis Diaz is a yellow is partly because of what I mentioned in terms of just recency bias in terms of form. But that can change very, very quickly. But another thing to mention is, as I said, the midfield position being so stacked and the forward position being a little bit more flexible in terms of all the options that you can actually access and how we're not really spoiled for choice right now just means that Gakpo probably becomes a bit of a better pick. And so that's why I quite like Gakpo. What I will mention about Gakpo, though, is that his underlying stats aren't necessarily crazy. For someone who isn't playing 90 minutes a game, for someone who isn't on penalties, just be cautious that he's not, for example, an amazing stellar pick, but I think definitely a very strong pick because that Jota injury definitely bolsters his minutes, and you can at least bank in the short-term fixtures of the next 3 for Liverpool, which is basically Ipswich, Wolves, Bournemouth, Everton, these kind of games. So you can't really beat that ultimately. And I know a lot of people want to jump onto slot as well. So there's obviously considerations as to how you approach triple Liverpool. And I'm not going to legislate for what is the best option, but Gakpo's up there. I do personally prefer a double up still of the defense right now. And that's simply because if I think about using the amount of money to go towards Gakpo, I probably don't actually want to spend that much money in terms of the forwards. And that's just my personal preference right now with me wanting to keep my money within the midfield. As far as the next tier with Watkins and Jackson, I've made some soft changes there. So Watkins and Jackson basically just changed places. This is because Jackson has unfortunately not conquered his great home fixtures, and the chances and I guess Chelsea's overall performance have been poor. He hasn't really taken his opportunities. I think that's fair to say. Even if you look at specifically the match in GW23, that was plenty of chances for him that he really wasted. You can argue that that's typical Jackson, but I think Watkins is also someone who's been guilty previously of wasting a lot of chances. He's just scored some of his recent ones. And so Watkins now having 3 great fixtures in a row versus Jackson actually having 3 out of 4 bad fixtures in 4, with West Ham at home being the good one that he shares in common with Watkins. That's why these 2 players have shifted around in my estimations. And then actually moving towards the defense now, I've given Konsa a rise because the fixtures are really, really good. I've added Dunk and Nico Williams to the cheat sheet because I'm pretty confident now in Nico Williams' position being locked down, even though Alex Moreno is, a distant threat, I suppose, if he ever is to play poorly. Dunk is also added to the sheet, but I have to say he's actually, of an age and suffered so many injuries where I think there's obviously, I can understand noticeably a lot of concern that people might have for approaching Dunk. What I will say though is that the Brighton defensive numbers have actually looked a little bit better in recent weeks, and I do think that they're sort of on an upward surge. But when you look at where they're positioned in terms of expected goals conceded, I can understand why someone isn't particularly interested in sort of investing into the Dunk business in Brighton, even though they're good games. Now, in the next tier of players, I've given Kirk as a rise, and that's simply because we're a few bad games removed from Bournemouth, and we're now a lot closer towards the good fixtures. And ultimately, that's why Kirk gets a rise with a really good home fixture here versus a pretty. I'd still say at the end of the day, I think Nottingham Forest is still a bottom half offense, and that's not to say, or that's not to discredit Nottingham Forest as a team. Ultimately, when you actually look at, for example, Premier League goals scored, I think that even supports that sort of argument, right? Both expected goals and goals scored for Nottingham Forest have not been exceptionally good. They're actually in the bottom half for both. And so I think that's just a fair argument to make, that if you have a Nottingham Forest at home game, that's actually still a good opportunity, really, to be able to enjoy someone like a Kirkes, who actually plays for a really strong defense as well. So where Bournemouth have been so impressive this season, I think, is when you contrast to, let's say, a team like Fulham, who are very, very strong in terms of defense, probably a little bit weaker on offense. Bournemouth have been incredibly impressive in both assets of play, and they've been a really, really good attack this season. And the defense has lagged slightly behind, but they're still comfortably top half, and that's really impressive. The only other change that I've made is Murillo Milenkovic getting a dropped, and that simply is fixture driven. When you look at the fixtures, I think, yes, you can definitely say Nottingham Forest are one of the best defenses in the league. Their players are probably underpriced respective to that, but if you just look at the run for the next 5-6 games, it is truly that bad. And when we come out of the end of these fixtures, I'm sure these players will turn back to being yellow and green options, but that's just me recognizing fixtures when they're fixtures. Tarkovsky being another pick being added here. I still think he's not that interesting because you can just go for Mykolenko. I really doubt people are going to double up within the defensive position. You can double up in the sense of going for Pickford plus another defender. I think that's fine and acceptable, but maybe doubling up in defense, I think, is overkill. In the next tier, I've given Robinson a rise and Timber a fall. Timber a fall because short-term games in terms of like City isn't great around Game Week 24. I think that's a good opportunity to potentially sell, but the fixtures are still really good for Arsenal. So the way I see it is that there's a soft impact of Saliba being injured, and so probably you don't think that there's incredible value from Arsenal for the next 2 weeks whilst we try to reposition or restructure our team around, expensive players like Timber and Gabriel, and think about how to organize around maybe the double instead and more pressing priority fixtures for some of the cheaper players within the game, which I think is totally acceptable. So Robinson also getting a rise is, I guess I have to put my hands up and say, despite slightly above average underlying stats, Robinson has continued to deliver a lot, and fair play to owners. Do I still think that he's a green pick? No, not necessarily, but has he been overachieving the season? Entirely, very much so. And so, yeah, just got to put my hands up and say he's been an extremely effectual asset within the game. Do I still think that the other Fulham players are very, very much worth it at their price points too, like Castagna Anderson? Yes. And so, once again, Fulham have been an extremely impressive defense, fourth now in expected goals conceded, and we sort of made that point a couple of weeks ago, and I'm very happy with where they're at. Fulham has just been a very impressive lockdown defense. In the next tier, we have Virgil getting a rise. He definitely deserves this rise because of the impending fixtures. Gabriel and Saliba get a drop because of these sort of short-term impacts, and I think the kind of almost template structure shifts where this is a good opportunity to drop Arsenal defense if you want to, right? Ultimately, though, when you look at the fixtures, it's 3 out of 4 games here, so it's all about optimizing the way you want. You can keep these Arsenal defenders, and I think it's still a very good, astute decision. So it's really up to you and your personal preference as to how you maximize around maybe prioritizing Liverpool in the short term, or even moving a lot of your money outside of the defensive positions to restructure in the midfield and the forward positions. As far as the goalkeeping positions, just to round out there, I've given Flecken and Verbruggen soft rises. This is just to kind of recognize that I think these players are still really good value at their price point. Sells clearly has already completely left them in terms of price, and he's gotten so many price rises, and he's in a tier of his own, playing for a defense of his own. The benefit that Sells will have whilst Nottingham Forest actually have a poor run of games is ultimately the value of being a goalkeeper, right? So even when you have bad fixtures, you can hedge a lot better than some of your other defenders who will just be losing -1s in tougher games, whereas Sells can at least get save points, which I think rectifies things the most. And then, of course, if they get the odd clean, which clearly they're capable of doing with the level of defense that they are at, then Sells is going to benefit the most as well within those circumstances too. So not recognizing that, I mean, at the end of the day, Nottingham Forest have really good defenders like Milenkovic, the header threat, Murillo, I guess the bonus threat, Aina, just the open play threat. So really, really good defense overall, really good picks. I think Sells is probably still a very, very easy hold for a lot of managers, and that's just a reflection of that. But that's going to be the cheat sheet for Gaming 23. I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.